The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III stood before the tall windows of his private study. His weathered hands gripped a cup of Earl Grey tea that had long since grown cold. The weight of the crown felt heavier than usual on this particular Tuesday in March, not because of any official ceremony, but because of the conversation he was about to have with his wife, Queen Camilla. The palace corridors buzzed with the usual morning activities. Staff members moved with practiced efficiency, their footsteps echoing softly against the marble floors. But beneath the surface of this royal routine, tension simmered like water just before it boils. The king had made a decision that would shake the very foundations of the royal family, and he knew there would be no turning back once the words left his lips. Camilla entered the study with her characteristic grace, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. She wore a deep blue dress that complemented her eyes, and her smile was warm as she approached her husband. They had been married for nearly 2 decades, weathering countless storms together, from public scrutiny to family drama. But nothing had prepared them for what was about to unfold. "Good morning, darling," Camilla said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "You look troubled. Is everything all right with the Commonwealth meetings next week?" Charles set down his teacup with deliberate care. The china clinked softly against the saucer, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind, but now, facing his wife's trusting gaze, the words felt like stones in his throat. "Camilla, we need to discuss your family," he began, his voice steady but strained. "Specifically, their recent behavior and its impact on the crown." The Queen's expression shifted subtly, the warmth in her eyes replaced by a flicker of concern. She had always been protective of her children and grandchildren, just as any mother would be. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez had grown up in the public eye, but they had generally managed to stay out of major scandals. Recently, however, things had changed. "What about them?" she asked carefully. The king stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The view of the palace grounds usually brought him comfort, but today it felt like a gilded cage. Tom's gambling debts have reached an astronomical level. The press is beginning to sniff around the story. And Laura's husband's business dealings. He paused, struggling with the weight of his words. "There are allegations of money laundering, Camilla. Serious ones." The color drained from the Queen's face. She had heard whispers, of course, but she had chosen to believe they were just malicious gossip from those who resented her position. The reality of her husband's words hit her like a physical blow. "Surely we can handle this quietly," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The palace has dealt with family scandals before. We have the best legal teams, the most discreet advisors." Charles turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. "It's too late for quiet solutions. The FBI has opened an investigation into Harry Lopez's business connections. They've frozen several accounts. And Tom," he shook his head, "Tom owes money to some very dangerous people, Camilla. People who won't hesitate to use his connection to the royal family for leverage." The study fell silent except for the steady tick of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Each second felt like an eternity as the implications of the king's words settled between them like a chasm neither could cross. "What are you saying, Charles?" Camilla asked, though she already knew the answer. "I'm saying that for the protection of the crown, for the stability of the monarchy, your family must be distanced from all royal activities. No more official functions, no more palace appearances, no more royal titles or considerations." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Camilla felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her children and grandchildren were her world, just as William and Harry were Charles's world. The thought of cutting them off from royal life, of essentially disowning them publicly, was almost unbearable. "You're asking me to choose," she said quietly. "I'm not asking," Charles replied, and his voice carried the authority of centuries of monarchy. "I'm telling you what must happen. The decision has already been made." The Queen stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She walked to the window and stood beside her husband, looking out at the gardens where she had imagined her grandchildren playing at future royal gatherings. Those dreams now crumbled like autumn leaves. "How long have you known?" she asked. "The intelligence reports started coming in 3 weeks ago. I've been meeting with advisors, trying to find another way. But there isn't one, Camilla. Not if we want to protect the institution of the monarchy." The palace around them continued its morning routine, but for the king and queen, time seemed suspended. Outside, tourists gathered at the gates, hoping for a glimpse of royalty. Inside, a royal marriage hung in the balance as duty and love waged war in two hearts. "What happens now?" Camilla whispered. "Now we prepare for the storm," Charles said. "The palace will issue a statement this afternoon. Your family will be given 48 hours to respond before the announcement goes public." As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting new shadows across the palace grounds, the royal couple stood side by side at the window. But the distance between them had never felt greater. The crown that had brought them together was now threatening to tear them apart, and neither was certain their marriage could survive what was about to come. The 48 hours passed like a fever dream. Queen Camilla had barely slept, spending most of her time on urgent phone calls with her children, trying to explain the impossible situation they all found themselves in. Tom had broken down completely during their first conversation, admitting that his gambling problem was worse than anyone had imagined. Laura had been defiant at first, insisting that her husband was innocent of any wrongdoing. But as more details emerged, even she began to understand the gravity of their circumstances. The palace staff noticed the change immediately. The queen, usually warm and engaging with everyone from kitchen maids to senior advisors, had become a ghostly figure moving through the corridors with hollow eyes and forced smiles. She attended her scheduled meetings, but her mind was elsewhere, focused on a family that was about to be severed from royal life forever. King Charles threw himself into his work with an intensity that worried his private secretary. He signed documents without his usual careful review, cut meetings short, and avoided eye contact with his wife during the few moments they shared. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a physical burden, but he knew there was no alternative. The monarchy had survived for over 1,000 years by making hard choices, and this was perhaps the hardest of his reign. The palace communications team worked around the clock to prepare for the announcement. Every word was carefully chosen, every possible public reaction considered. The statement would be brief but decisive, leaving no room for misinterpretation while trying to minimize damage to the royal family's reputation. On Thursday afternoon, as storm clouds gathered over London, the moment arrived. The king and queen sat in the throne room, a space usually reserved for the most formal of state occasions. Today, it felt more like a courtroom where their marriage was on trial. Sir Edmund Hartley, the king's private secretary, entered with a folder containing the final statement. His face was grave as he approached the couple who sat several feet apart, the space between them feeling like an ocean. "Your Majesties," he began, his voice carefully neutral. "The statement is ready for your final approval." Charles took the document without looking at his wife. As he read the formal language that would destroy Camilla's family connections to the crown, his jaw tightened. The words were cold, professional, and absolutely final. "The palace announces that effective immediately, members of Her Majesty Queen Camilla's extended family will no longer participate in official royal duties or receive any benefits associated with the royal family. This decision has been made in the best interests of the crown and the British people." The Queen listened to the statement being read aloud, each word feeling like a nail in her family's coffin. When Sir Edmund finished, the silence in the throne room was deafening. Outside, London carried on with its daily rhythm, unaware that inside the palace walls, a personal tragedy was unfolding. "There's more," Sir Edmund continued reluctantly. "The press has gotten wind of something. We've had calls from several major newspapers asking for comment about Tom Parker Bowles and allegations regarding gambling debts. The story will likely break tomorrow morning regardless of our announcement." Camilla closed her eyes, feeling the last of her hope slip away. She had harbored a secret wish that somehow this could all be handled privately, that her children could quietly resolve their problems without public humiliation. Now she realized how naive that hope had been. "Release the statement," Charles said firmly. "We control the narrative this way." "Charles," Camilla spoke for the first time since entering the room. Her voice was barely audible. "Please, give them one more chance. Let me talk to them again." The king finally looked at his wife, and what she saw in his eyes broke her heart completely. There was love there, but also resignation and an iron determination that she recognized from their early courtship days. When Charles made up his mind about something important, nothing could change it. "The time for second chances has passed," he said gently but firmly. "The crown comes first. It always has, and it always will." Sir Edmund cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Your Majesty, we also need to discuss the practical arrangements. Will the Queen's family be allowed to remain in their current residences? What about their security details?" "All royal security will be withdrawn immediately," Charles answered without hesitation. They'll need to make their own arrangements for protection. As for residences, they have 30 days to vacate any properties tied to the crown. Camilla felt physically ill. Her grandchildren would lose their homes, their security, their entire way of life because of her family's mistakes. The guilt was overwhelming, but beneath it, a seed of anger began to grow. Her husband was abandoning her family with the same clinical efficiency he brought to state business. "What about Christmas?" she asked quietly. "Will they still be welcome for family gatherings?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Christmas at the palace was a cherished tradition, one that had taken years for Camilla's children to feel comfortable participating in. The thought of future holidays without them seemed unbearable. "We'll need to see how things develop," Charles replied diplomatically, which they both knew meant no. As the afternoon wore on, senior staff members were briefed on the situation. The news spread through the palace like wildfire, though everyone was sworn to absolute secrecy until the official announcement. The Prince and Princess of Wales were informed by secure phone call, and their shock was evident even through the formal language of their response. By evening, Queen Camilla had retreated to her private apartments. She stood on her balcony overlooking the palace gardens, the same gardens she had gazed at that morning with her husband. Everything looked the same, but her world had fundamentally changed. Her phone buzzed with another call from Tom. She had been avoiding his calls for hours, unable to bear hearing her son's voice break as he apologized repeatedly for destroying their family's place in royal history. Laura had stopped calling altogether, probably preparing for the media siege that was about to descend on her family. The Queen realized that in trying to protect the monarchy, her husband had possibly destroyed their marriage. The distance between them was no longer just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and perhaps permanent. She wondered if Charles understood that in saving the crown, he might have lost his queen. As darkness fell over London, Buckingham Palace prepared to weather another storm. But, this time, the damage might be irreparable, and the silence that would follow the announcement would be more deafening than any scandal that had come before. The announcement hit the British public like a thunderbolt on Friday morning. By 6 a.m., every major newspaper in the country had the story splashed across their front pages. "Queen's family banished from palace," screamed the headlines, accompanied by photographs of Tom Parker Bowles looking haggard outside a London casino and Laura Lopez hurrying into a lawyer's office with her head down. The palace switchboard was overwhelmed within hours. Journalists from around the world demanded statements, explanations, and interviews. Royal correspondents who had covered the family for decades struggled to understand how such a dramatic decision had been made so quietly and so quickly. Queen Camilla remained in her private apartments, refusing to see anyone except her closest lady-in-waiting, Margaret Thornfield. Margaret had served the royal family for 30 years and had never seen her mistress in such a state of despair. The Queen sat by her window, still in her nightgown at noon, staring at nothing while the world exploded with news about her family's disgrace. "Your Majesty," Margaret said gently, setting down a tray of untouched breakfast from earlier. "Perhaps you should dress. The King has requested a meeting at 2 o'clock. Camilla didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow. "What's the point, Margaret? I'm no longer really the Queen, am I? A queen protects her family. A queen doesn't abandon them to save herself. You haven't abandoned anyone, Your Majesty. You've been placed in an impossible position. Have I?" Camilla turned from the window for the first time in hours. "Or have I simply chosen my comfort over my children's welfare? Perhaps I should have stood up to Charles. Perhaps I should have threatened to abdicate if he went through with this." Margaret had no answer to that. In all her years of service, she had learned when to speak and when to remain silent. This was definitely a time for silence. Meanwhile, King Charles was in crisis management mode. He had been in back-to-back meetings since dawn, dealing with parliamentary concerns, Commonwealth questions, and urgent calls from other European monarchs who wanted to understand what was happening in London. The Prime Minister had requested an emergency meeting, concerned about how this royal family drama might affect the government's agenda. The Archbishop of Canterbury had called to express his worries about the moral implications of cutting off family members. Even the Queen Mother's former friends had somehow gotten through to palace staff to express their disapproval. But it was the call from Prince William that shook Charles the most. His son's voice was carefully controlled, but the underlying anger was unmistakable. "Father, I need to understand your reasoning," William said during their secure video call. "From the outside, this looks like you've thrown Camilla's family to the wolves to save face. How is that different from the media treatment our mother received?" The comparison to Diana hit Charles like a physical blow. He sat heavily in his chair, suddenly, feeling every one of his 75 years. This is completely different, William. This is about criminal behavior, not personal choices. Is it? Or is it about you being so afraid of scandal that you'll sacrifice anyone to avoid it? Because that's what it looks like from here. The conversation ended badly, with William expressing doubt about his father's judgment for the first time in years. Charles realized that in trying to protect the monarchy's reputation, he might have damaged his relationship with his heir. By afternoon, the situation had spiraled beyond anyone's control. Tom Parker Bowles had been photographed leaving his London home with several suitcases, clearly moving out to avoid the media circus. Reporters had surrounded the building, shouting questions about his gambling debts and his mother's reaction to his exile from royal life. Laura Lopez had released a brief statement through her lawyer, denying any knowledge of illegal activities and expressing her disappointment in the royal family's decision to abandon her family without due process. The statement was carefully worded but clearly bitter, adding fuel to the media fire. The public reaction was more divided than palace officials had expected. While some supported the king's decisive action to distance the monarchy from potential criminal activity, others saw it as a heartless abandonment of family members who hadn't been proven guilty of anything. Social media buzzed with debates about royal responsibility, family loyalty, and the price of maintaining institutional integrity. #StandByFamily and #ProtectTheCrown became opposing trending hashtags as the nation chose sides in a very public family feud. Queen Camilla finally emerged from her apartments late in the afternoon, dressed in a simple black suit that seemed appropriate for mourning. She walked through the palace corridors like a ghost, barely acknowledging the staff members who bowed as she passed. Everyone could see that something fundamental had broken inside her. The meeting with King Charles took place in the smaller drawing room rather than his study. The change of venue felt significant, as if even Charles recognized that their relationship had shifted into unknown territory. "How are you holding up?" he asked as she entered, and the question struck them both as absurd given the circumstances. "I've been better," she replied coolly, taking a seat across from him rather than beside him as she usually would. "Camilla, I know this is difficult, but we'll get through this together. The initial shock will fade, the media will move on to other stories, and we can rebuild." "Rebuild what, Charles? My relationship with my children? Their trust in me? Their respect for this institution we're supposed to represent?" Her voice was steady, but there was steel in it that he hadn't heard before. "We can rebuild our marriage, our life together. Your family made their choices, and now we all have to live with the consequences." The Queen looked at her husband as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "You know what I realized today? You've never really understood what it's like to be the outsider in this family. You were born into this world, raised for it, prepared for it your entire life. I was thrown into it as an adult, and I've spent 20 years trying to prove I belong here." She stood and walked to the window, the same pose that had started this nightmare 3 days earlier. "But my children never belonged here. They were always just tolerated because they came with me. And the moment they became inconvenient, you discarded them like yesterday's newspapers." Charles felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "That's not how I see it, isn't it? Then, tell me, Charles, if William or Harry had gambling debts or business troubles, would you handle it the same way?" The silence that followed was answer enough. They both knew that blood royalty would never be treated the same way as royalty by marriage, no matter how many years had passed or how many vows had been exchanged. As evening approached, Buckingham Palace had never felt so silent despite the chaos surrounding it. The king and queen were together but alone, united by their titles but divided by their choices. And outside the palace gates, the world watched and waited to see if the monarchy could survive yet another crisis, or if this time, the price of survival had simply been too high. 3 weeks after the announcement that shattered the royal family, Buckingham Palace had settled into an eerie new normal. The media frenzy had begun to die down, but the aftermath lingered like smoke after a fire. Queen Camilla moved through her daily duties with mechanical precision, attending charity events and state functions with a smile that never reached her eyes. The separation between the king and queen had become an open secret within palace walls. They maintained public appearances together, but privately, they lived essentially separate lives. Charles worked longer hours, traveling frequently for Commonwealth duties that kept him away from the palace and the uncomfortable silence that had replaced their once warm conversations. Tom Parker Bowles had quietly left England altogether, reportedly staying with friends in France while seeking treatment for his gambling addiction. The criminal investigations into his debts had stalled, with prosecutors focusing on the loan sharks rather than Tom himself. But the damage to his reputation was complete. Laura Lopez had withdrawn from public life entirely, homeschooling her children to avoid the media attention that followed them everywhere. The most heartbreaking casualty of the entire situation was the relationship between Camilla and her grandchildren. The young ones didn't understand why they couldn't visit the palace anymore, or why their grandmother seemed so sad during their brief, supervised phone calls. The older grandchildren had begun to piece together what had happened, and their confusion was turning into resentment. On a gray Tuesday morning in April, Sir Edmund Hartley requested an urgent meeting with King Charles. The private secretary's usually composed demeanor showed cracks of worry that set off alarm bells for everyone who knew him well. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "we have a situation that requires immediate attention. The Queen has submitted a formal request to step back from all royal duties indefinitely." Charles looked up from his correspondence, his face showing the strain of the past month. "What exactly does that mean?" "She's essentially asking for a separation of duties, sir. She would retain her title but would not participate in any official functions, charity work, or public appearances. It's unprecedented in modern royal history." The king set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. He had seen this coming, but the reality still hit him like a punch to the chest. Has she given a reason? She states that she can no longer effectively represent the crown while dealing with personal family matters. She's also requested that Clarence House be prepared as a separate residence. The implications were staggering. A queen stepping back from duties while remaining married to the king would create a constitutional crisis unlike anything the monarchy had faced. It would raise questions about the stability of the royal family, the king's judgment, and the future of the institution itself. "Where is she now?" Charles asked. "In her private apartments, Your Majesty. She's refused to see anyone except Lady Margaret for the past 2 days." That afternoon, Charles made the walk to his wife's apartments feeling like he was approaching his own execution. The familiar corridors seemed longer somehow, and the portraits of past monarchs looked down on him with what felt like judgment. He had made the right choice for the crown, he told himself, but why did it feel so wrong? He found Camilla sitting in her reading chair, a book unopened in her lap, staring out at the gardens where spring flowers were beginning to bloom. She looked older somehow, as if the past month had aged her years instead of weeks. "Margaret tells me you want to step back from your duties," he said, taking the chair across from her. "I want to do many things, Charles. I want to turn back time and handle my family's problems differently. I want to find a way to protect both the crown and my children. I want to wake up from this nightmare." She finally looked at him. "But since none of those things are possible, yes, I want to step back. You know what this will do to the monarchy. The speculation, the questions about our marriage, the constitutional implications. And you know what staying will do to me. I can't smile and wave and pretend everything is fine when my children have been destroyed by this institution I've served faithfully for 20 years. Charles reached for her hand, but she pulled away. The gesture was small, but it felt like a door closing between them. "There has to be another way," he said. "There was another way. You chose not to take it." The conversation was interrupted by Sir Edmund's urgent knock. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but you need to see this immediately." He handed Charles a tablet showing a live news broadcast. The headline read, "Queen Camilla's son speaks out," and showed Tom Parker Bowles sitting across from a respected BBC journalist in what appeared to be a simple living room in France. "I want to be clear about something," Tom was saying on screen, his voice steady despite his obvious emotional distress. "My mother had absolutely no knowledge of my gambling problems or my poor financial decisions. She's being punished for my failures, and that's not right." The interviewer leaned forward. "But surely the royal family had a duty to distance itself from potential scandal? The royal family had a duty to help a family member in crisis, not abandon him. My mother has given everything to the crown. She's been attacked, criticized, and questioned every day for 20 years, and she bore it all with grace because she believed in the institution. The thanks she gets is to have her family thrown away the moment we become inconvenient." Charles watched in horror as his stepson continued to speak with a dignity that made the royal family's response look petty and cruel. Tom wasn't defending his actions or making excuses. He was simply telling the truth about how the situation had been handled, and the truth was devastating. "I've lost my home, my security, my place in the only family I've known for 2 decades. But the real tragedy is what this has done to my mother. She's been forced to choose between her children and her crown, and no mother should ever have to make that choice. The interview continued for several more minutes, with Tom expressing love for his stepfather but disappointment in his actions. He spoke about his grandmother's memory and how she had always emphasized the importance of family. Most damaging of all, he revealed that the criminal investigations into his affairs had found no evidence of intentional wrongdoing, just poor judgment and addiction. When the broadcast ended, the three occupants of the Queen's sitting room sat in stunned silence. The damage was incalculable. Tom had managed to make the royal family look heartless and hypocritical without saying a single unkind word about anyone personally. He's right, Camilla said quietly. About all of it. Charles felt the weight of his crown more heavily than ever before. In trying to protect the monarchy, he had perhaps inflicted more damage on it than any scandal could have done. The public was already beginning to turn against what they saw as an unnecessarily harsh response to family problems. Over the following days, the palace watched helplessly as public opinion shifted decisively against the king's handling of the situation. Social media campaigns calling for Camilla's family to be reinstated gained momentum. Several prominent politicians questioned whether the royal family's response had been proportionate to the alleged crimes. Most troubling of all, Prince William publicly expressed support for his stepmother, stating that families should stand together during difficult times. The implicit criticism of his father's decision sent shockwaves through the establishment and further undermined Charles's position. As the month drew to a close, King Charles faced a choice that would define his reign. He could continue on the path he had chosen, potentially losing his wife and damaging the monarchy's reputation for generations, or he could admit his mistake and try to rebuild what he had torn down. The palace fell into a different kind of silence now, not the breathless anticipation of scandal, but the heavy quiet that comes before a momentous decision. Everyone waited to see whether the king who had chosen duty over family could find a way to choose both, or whether the cost of his crown would ultimately be everything he held dear. The gardens outside bloomed with spring flowers, but inside the palace walls, it felt like winter might last forever.